These days, when we think about the biggest stage in bodybuilding, there's no way not to mention Mr. Olympia. That name carries weight, history, and major respect. Winning the Olympia means joining a very exclusive club of legends. It's like winning the World Cup or an Oscar, but in the world of muscle. The title isn't just about having the perfect physique, it's about discipline, resilience, and years of insane dedication. But did you know it wasn't always like this? Mr. Olympia didn't start out as the giant it is today. When it first launched in 1965, most people had no idea what it would become. Just a few athletes showed up, the setup was basic, and the prize barely made a splash. Still, that first night in New York was something special. It marked the beginning of what would completely reshape professional bodybuilding. And since we're talking about beginnings, let me share some exciting news with you. This video is the kickoff of a brand new playlist here on the channel, where we'll explore every single edition of Mr. Olympia, year by year, detail by detail. We're going back in time to break down the full history, starting from 1965 and working our way to the present. It's a big project, but it's going to be awesome diving into all of this with you. By the way, before we keep going, did you know most people who watch our videos still haven't subscribed to the channel? If that's you, give us a shot. Hit that subscribe button and join the crew. The creation of Mr. Olympia gave athletes back then a brand new purpose. Up until that point, their biggest goals were Mr. Universe or Mr. America. And after that, they'd usually retire with nothing more to aim for. There was no final boss, no true summit to climb. That's when the idea hit. What if there was a competition where the best of the best could battle it out? And just like that, a legend was born. What started as a wild dream. Fun fact, the name was actually inspired by a beer, turned into a milestone in sports history. Since that legendary night in 1965, Mr. Olympia has never left the spotlight. Every year, it's grown in size, prize money, media coverage, and global impact. And with that, the pressure and expectations also skyrocketed, along with the level of the athletes brave enough to step on that stage. If bodybuilding is recognized worldwide today, we owe a lot of that to the Olympia. This competition made the sport legit, serious, professional, and worthy of the global stage. It's where the biggest icons were born. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ronnie Coleman, Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, and so many more. They didn't just win the trophy. They carried the weight of an entire generation on their shoulders. Before Mr. Olympia existed, the top of the bodybuilding world was represented by two major titles, Mr. America and Mr. Universe. Winning either meant you were seen as one of the greatest out there. But there was a catch. After that, there was nowhere else to go. A lot of athletes peaked and then just faded out. The sport didn't offer any real continuity, nothing massive enough to justify keeping up the grind. Guys like Steve Reeves, John Grimek, and Reg Park are perfect examples. These were legends with insane physiques who inspired thousands. But even they hit a wall. After dominating the biggest titles of the time, they didn't have any clear next goal. Their careers ended way too early, even though they still had so much to give. That gap at the top was a big concern, especially for Joe Weider. Magazine editor, bodybuilding fanatic, and full-on visionary, Joe believed the sport needed something bigger. He saw these athletes as superstars and wanted the world to see them that way too. So he started dreaming of a new kind of contest, one that would bring together the absolute best and take bodybuilding to a whole new level. And Joe Weider didn't just dream, he had the tools to make it happen. Through his magazines, like the iconic Muscle Builder, he turned bodybuilding into pop culture, built heroes, and mobilized fans everywhere. It was through this media empire that he started planting the seeds, pushing the idea that the sport needed a final showdown, a real world championship to crown the one true bodybuilding king. The lack of a true ultimate title was frustrating, even for the athletes themselves. Guys like Larry Scott even thought about retiring young because there just weren't any more challenges left. Imagine training for years, winning the biggest titles out there, and then just stopping. Joe realized that if the sport wanted to keep evolving, it had to give its best athletes a reason to stay in the game. And that meant creating a new goal to chase. That's when the idea of Mr. Olympia was born. It wouldn't be just another contest. It would be the grand finale of bodybuilding, a competition where only champions could compete. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If Mr. Universe and Mr. America were stepping stones, then the Olympia would be the final destination, the stage where legends go head-to-head. And that concept instantly caught the attention of both athletes and fans. Can you imagine the impact that had back then? An exclusive tournament with the biggest names in the world, all fighting for the title of the best of the best. It was exactly what bodybuilding needed, and no one had a clue how much things were about to change. The creation of Mr. Olympia didn't come from some formal meeting with charts, spreadsheets, and a strategic plan. Nope, it all started in the most unexpected way, over a casual dinner between two people who would end up changing the sport forever, Joe Weider and Larry Scott. Joe was restless. He wanted something new. He felt like the athletes needed a bigger stage, a real challenge, something that truly represented the peak of the sport. During that dinner, Joe shared his frustration with Larry, how it bothered him to see guys like Steve Reeves and Reg Park retiring while still in their prime. They got so far, and now what? What's left to achieve? He asked. That's when he started floating his idea, creating a tournament above all others, reserved only for the absolute best in the world. A competition that would officially crown the greatest bodybuilder alive. Larry listened closely, clearly excited by the concept. But then came the big question. So, what's this new tournament going to be called? Joe paused, glanced at the beer bottle on the table, and saw the label, Olympia Beer. And right there, it clicked. He slapped the table and said, "I've got it. We'll call it Mr. Olympia." Simple, bold, memorable, and packed with symbolic punch. Larry Scott wasn't thrilled at first. As a devout Mormon, he avoided any association with alcohol, and the fact that the name came from a beer bothered him. But Joe, being Joe, was quick to reframe it. "Larry, forget the beer. Think of Olympia as in Mount Olympus, home of the gods. It's perfect. The greatest gods of bodybuilding will battle for that title." And that's how the name stuck. A beer label turned into a symbol. Mr. Olympia came to represent something almost mythical, like the athletes were climbing to the top of Mount Olympus itself. The name sounded powerful, epic, and grand, exactly the vibe Joe wanted for the event. And even with its odd origin, it instantly carried an air of respect and awe. It's crazy how big ideas can come from the simplest moments. A dinner, a real conversation, a bottle on the table, and boom, the name of what would become the most iconic event in bodybuilding history was sealed. Sometimes destiny reveals itself in the little things. And in that moment, without either of them realizing it, the sport entered a brand new chapter. Now that you know where the name came from, tell me, did you ever guess that Mr. Olympia was inspired by a beer? Then came the big day, September 18th, 1965. The venue chosen for this historic moment was the elegant and iconic Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York. A theater that had hosted all kinds of artistic performances was now about to witness something totally new. The debut of the competition that would change bodybuilding forever. The first ever Mr. Olympia. The anticipation was sky high, both among the athletes and the fans who packed the auditorium. But the Olympia wasn't alone. That same night also featured two other major events. Mr. America, which was won by Dave Draper, and Mr. Universe, won by Earl Maynard. The goal was to turn the night into a true bodybuilding festival, blending tradition and innovation into one epic show. And it worked. The crowd went wild with everything they saw on stage. The whole vibe was more than just competitive. It was theatrical, electrifying, almost like a movie. There were live rock bands, gymnastics routines, martial arts demos, and even karate masters smashing bricks with their bare hands. And all that happened before a single bodybuilder stepped on stage. It was a full-blown celebration, and bodybuilding was finally showing the world it knew how to entertain. Over 2,000 people packed the theater, and hundreds more were stuck outside without tickets. These were die-hard fans, many traveling from far away just to see their heroes in real life, guys they'd only seen in magazines until then. One of them was a 13-year-old kid named Mike Mincer, who would later become one of the sport's biggest icons. He described that night as nothing short of a religious experience. It was in that electric atmosphere that the Mr. America title was decided. Dave Draper, with his classic California Golden Boy look and a seriously impressive physique, took the win fair and square. Known as the Blonde Bomber, Draper was already a fan favorite thanks to his magazine appearances, but now he was shining live, right in front of his fans. His fame would only grow as he went on to star in Hollywood movies, becoming a true icon both on and off the stage. Next up was the battle for Mr. Universe, featuring athletes from all over the globe. The contest was divided into classes, and the winner of the tall class was none other than Earl Maynard, a powerhouse from Barbados with a wide, well-balanced, and incredibly conditioned physique. He beat out tough competitors like Frank Zane and Rick Wayne, taking home the title and securing the right to compete that same night in the very first Mr. Olympia. With the first 2 titles awarded, the crowd was already hyped. But the most anticipated moment was still ahead, the debut of Mr. Olympia. Even though only 3 men were competing, the symbolic weight of that moment was massive. Everyone in the room knew they were about to witness something special, something that would go down in history. It might sound odd today, but the first ever Mr. Olympia in 1965 had just 3 competitors. That said, those 3 guys represented the very best of bodybuilding at the time. Each had his own accomplishments, style, and standout qualities. They weren't there by chance. They truly were the top athletes in the world at that moment. The first was Larry Scott, 26 years old and already a champion of both Mr. America and Mr. Universe. He was easily the most recognizable face of the era. Joe Weider's magazines loved him, and fans couldn't get enough. His massive arms and flawless posing made him a standout. Larry wasn't just built. He had star power, stage presence, and a charisma that made him the fan favorite. Then came Harold Poole, a true prodigy. Just 21 years old, he still holds the record as the youngest competitor in Mr. Olympia history. He had already won Mr. Universe in 1963 and was known for his strength, muscle definition, and that legendary most muscular pose he nailed with perfection. His physique was intense, and he had a bold, aggressive vibe. The crowd loved him and gave him a hero's welcome. Rounding out the trio was Earl Maynard, 29 years old, fresh off his win at Mr. Universe earlier that same night. With a broad, symmetrical frame and sharp conditioning, Earl was a powerful presence. Even after competing earlier, he stepped up for the challenge and became one of the first men to ever walk the Olympia stage. His participation added even more prestige to this historic moment. Each of these 3 brought something totally unique to the stage. Larry had the classic, charismatic appeal. Harold was the young, jack powerhouse. Earl was the technical giant, coming off an international win. Together, they embodied the past, present, and future of bodybuilding, showcasing different styles, shapes, and performance approaches. It's crazy to think that even with just 3 competitors, the contest was loaded with emotion, intensity, and historical weight. Every pose was met with cheers, whistles, and a crowd that was totally into it. It wasn't just a competition, it was a celebration, a night that would define the future of the sport. Then came the big moment, the official Mr. Olympia debut on stage. It was time for the 3 finalists to battle it out in front of a buzzing, fully hyped crowd. Even with a modest setup, the energy was like a championship game. Fans knew they were about to witness a turning point in history. And when the first name was called, hearts were pounding. Earl Maynard went first, just hours after his Mr. Universe win. Despite the visible fatigue, he stepped on stage with confidence. His body still looked incredible, broad, strong, ripped. He flowed through his poses with grace and solid stage presence, though the exhaustion was clear. Still, when he hit his most muscular pose, the crowd roared. He proved he absolutely deserved to be there. Next up was Harold Poole, and the energy in the theater went through the roof. The young New Yorker was greeted with wild cheers and excitement. He walked on stage with swagger and instantly owned the room. When he hit that iconic, most muscular pose, the applause turned into a full-blown eruption. His traps and pecs looked like they were about to burst through his skin, and his symmetry mesmerized the audience. Poole knew exactly how to work the crowd. His performance was full of energy, with smooth transitions between poses and fierce expressions. He knew he was up against the crowd favorite and did everything he could to steal the spotlight. At several points, it honestly felt like he had the audience completely in the palm of his hand. With every pose, the cheers got louder. You could feel the tension building backstage. And then, finally, it was time for him, Larry Scott. The second the announcer started saying his name, the crowd erupted. The cheers were so loud they drowned out the intro. Larry walked out slowly, with a calm smile, and was greeted like a movie star. His presence was magnetic. He knew exactly what to do and how to do it. With those legendary biceps, Scott leaned into the poses that best highlighted his aesthetics. His arms looked like they were carved out of marble, and his confidence just radiated from stage. Every time he hit a pose, the place went wild. He even came back for multiple encores, answering the crowd's chants of more like a rock star. He was in full command of the moment. Even as the last to perform, Larry Scott left no doubt this was his night. With the perfect blend of physique, charisma, and stage presence, he put on a show that would stay etched in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. And now, with all three competitors having given their all, just one question remained. Who will be crowned the very first Mr. Olympia? The theater fell silent. After the jaw-dropping performances, especially from Harold Poole and Larry Scott, the crowd waited anxiously for the final announcement. There was tension, but also this electric sense of celebration. Everyone knew they were about to hear the name of the first Mr. Olympia in history. And this wasn't just about a title. It was the start of a whole new era in bodybuilding. Despite Harold Poole's explosive showing, his dense, aggressive physique had truly wowed the audience. Larry Scott's edge was undeniable. His mix of charisma, symmetry, and razor-sharp definition went beyond just the body. He captivated everyone. He wasn't just a competitor, he was a star, and that made a huge impact on the final decision. When the judges returned with their verdict, there was no dramatic pause. The decision was unanimous. Larry Scott was the champion. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers, and even a few tears. It was like everyone knew they had just witnessed something timeless. Larry Scott had officially become the first ever Mr. Olympia. But here's a fun twist. The advertised prize for the winner was $1,000, which was a solid amount back then. Instead, Joe Weider decided to give something way more symbolic, a luxurious crown, decorated with rubies, gold, and red velvet. It wasn't just a prize, it was a symbol of royalty in bodybuilding. Bold, flashy, and instantly iconic. Larry, though a bit reluctant, accepted the crown. As a devout Mormon and a humble guy, he didn't love the idea of being treated like a king. But at that moment, with the crowd roaring and cameras flashing, he understood what it really meant. It wasn't about vanity. It was about marking the beginning of something truly meaningful in the sport he loved. Standing next to him, Harold Poole proved to be a class act. Even though it was his second big runner-up finish in a row, he gracefully acknowledged Scott's win. The mutual respect between them was obvious, and that made the birth of Mr. Olympia even more dignified. Earl Maynard, who came in third, also got a well-deserved round of applause for the guts it took to compete in two high-level contests on the same day. And just like that, under a storm of applause and with a sparkling crown on his head, Larry Scott made history. The Olympia was born, and with it, a brand new era of professional bodybuilding. The stage had been set. The legends were just beginning to rise. Larry Scott's crowning as the first Mr. Olympia wasn't just the end of a contest. It was the start of a revolution. Up until that night, bodybuilding was still seen by many as niche, maybe even a bit of gimmick. Some people thought it was over the top or just something for fitness magazines. But the night of September 18th, 1965, flipped the script completely, and it changed the game forever. The fans walking out of the Brooklyn Academy of Music that night knew they had witnessed history. People were hyped, cheering, clapping, hugging the athletes. Some fans even carried the competitors on their shoulders through the streets of New York. It wasn't just admiration, it was devotion. For the first time, bodybuilding had been treated like a true spectacle, an art form, a sport, and a cultural moment all in one. With his movie star looks and flawless physique, Larry Scott became a true icon. He wasn't just a champion, he was a symbol, a modern-day hero. His face started popping up on more and more magazine covers. His training routines became the gold standard, and his presence helped elevate bodybuilding's status all around the world. He opened the doors for the sport to move out of the shadows of basement gyms and onto the biggest stages on Earth. But the impact wasn't just visual or media-driven. Mr. Olympia showed bodybuilders that there really was a future. Now, there was an annual competition worth chasing. And more importantly, there was recognition. Joe Weider, whom many saw as just a dreamer, proved that his vision could be real. Over time, the Olympia would grow into the biggest and most respected contest in the entire sport. Another game changer? The birth of a passionate fan base. The people who were in that theater that night never forgot it. Many of them would go on to become athletes, coaches, or even content creators. That energy in the room lit a fire in a whole new generation of bodybuilding lovers. People who started seeing the sport through different eyes. And the other two competitors, Poole and Earl Maynard, also walked away with a ton of respect. Poole, with his youth and jaw-dropping definition, earned global recognition and became one of the era's standout names. Maynard, with his powerful presence and versatility, went on to build a career not just in sports, but also in pro wrestling and film. All three of them, in their own way, left a legacy. From that point on, bodybuilding would never be the same. Olympia wasn't just a bold experiment anymore. It had become the new standard, a stage for legends. Behind every great event are the names that make it unforgettable. And in the case of the very first Mr. Olympia, it was three men who left a deep mark, not just on that competition, but on the entire history of bodybuilding. Each with a unique journey. They helped shape the sport's standards and inspire generations to come. So let's take a closer look at Larry Scott, Poole, and Earl Maynard. Starting with the night's big winner, Larry Scott, known as the Legend. And yeah, hearing that name, Larry was the first bodybuilder in history to win the three biggest titles of the time: Mr. America, Mr. Universe, and Mr. Olympia. But what really made him historic were those mind-blowing biceps, over 20 inches 50 centimeters, which was incredibly rare back then. Larry also became famous for popularizing an exercise that still carries his name, the Scott curl, originally called the preacher curl. With it, he built the most iconic arms of his generation. On top of that, Larry had natural charisma, elegant posture, and a Hollywood-worthy face. He wasn't just an athlete. He was the image of what bodybuilding could be. Then there's Poole, runner-up in both 1965 and 1966, and a true pioneer. At just 21 years old, he became the youngest competitor in Olympia history. But his impact goes way beyond age. Poole was the first African-American to reach that level of international success in bodybuilding, breaking barriers during a time still heavily marked by prejudice. His signature move was the iconic, most muscular pose, which he hit with such intensity that it left audiences speechless. He also had a tight waist, broad shoulders, and a kind of muscle density that was insane for someone his age. Harold brought an aggressive, technical style that would influence generations of athletes after him. And finally, there's Earl Maynard, a true man of many talents. Besides being a bodybuilder, he was also a pro wrestler and later a movie actor throughout the 70s and 80s, appearing in over 20 films. But his love for the sport never faded. Even after retiring, he kept promoting bodybuilding and showing up at events all around the world. Earl was known for his wide frame, balanced physique, and excellent stage presence. Winning Mr. Universe on the same day he competed in Mr. Olympia says a lot about his dedication and condition. He proved you could be versatile and still maintain top-level excellence. And he showed the world that bodybuilding could create iconic figures even outside the gym. These three men, so different from one another, shared the same stage and stepped into history together. They paved the way for the legends who would follow. What happened on September 18th, 1965, was more than a competition. It was the birth of an empire. Mr. Olympia started small, with just 3 competitors, a passionate crowd, and a velvet crown that looked more like a theater prop than a real trophy. But on that modest New York stage, the seed of the biggest bodybuilding championship on earth was planted, a seed that would grow into a dynasty. Years later, that same stage would witness the rise of Sergio Oliva, the impact of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the dominance of Lee Haney, the raw power of Ronnie Coleman, the aesthetics of Frank Zane, and so many other titans who would one day hold the Olympia title. Each one followed a different path, but they all walked in the footsteps of the original 3 who stood there in 1965, Scott, Poole, and Maynard. That night marked the true beginning of modern professional bodybuilding. And this story is about more than just muscle. It's about passion, vision, perseverance, and legacy. It's about how a sport that so many people doubted became a global phenomenon, thanks to those who believed, even when no one else did. The Olympia isn't just a trophy. It's a symbol of everything that can be achieved through real, relentless effort. And if you made it this far, it's because you love this story too. So take a second and hit that like button. It helps us a lot and keeps content like this going strong. And if you're not subscribed yet, give us a shot. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and come be part of this community that lives and breathes history, training, and inspiration. If you want to support the channel even more, consider becoming a member. It's a great way to keep this project growing and get access to exclusive content and perks. And of course, drop a comment. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Had you heard about all this before? Mr. Olympia started with a crown inspired by a beer, and today, it's the most coveted throne in all of bodybuilding. And this is just the beginning of our journey. So buckle up because the legend continues in the next videos.